So we are starting in verse 5. Let's read it together, okay? Genesis 1:5. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening and there was morning the first day. Now, what do you notice about that? Very, very interesting the way that's worded, right? Now, us in the West probably would say there's morning and evening, right? We kind of flip those around. There's a few notable things that we need to mention about the evening to morning construct. First of all, the Jewish Sabbath begins on Friday night at 6 p.m. and it runs through Saturday at 6 p.m. So we have an evening to evening contrast there. It's interesting. The evening oblation or sacrifice that you read about in the Bible, Daniel 9:21 being an example, was around the ninth hour or 3 p.m. in the evening. Now, what is interesting about that? Well, Jesus was crucified around the time of the evening sacrifice, which, considering he's the lamb that was slain, kind of makes sense. Perhaps the most significant thing about this passage is, again, the greater theme that is carried throughout Scripture. We fall into spiritual darkness in Genesis 3, and the Jewish people, in a sense, carry the light, or Christ, with them until he enters the earth, and that's recorded in the book of Matthew. The darkness to light motif is represented by the Hebrew words Erev and Boker, and they're translated as evening and morning. Erev comes from a root that can mean mixture or chaos. It reflects the indistinct blending of light and dark during twilight. Whereas Boker stems from a root associated with inspection or separation, as the light of morning brings clarity and distinction. Okay, in case you haven't seen the previous sessions, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to do a brief recap on some of the scriptures that kind of continue this dark to light motif. John 1, 1 through 6, which we've referenced a lot in previous teachings, it's obviously, of course, I'm not going to get back into all this, but it's obviously a nod back to the creation, and it makes a very interesting reference to light in verse 5 when it says, "The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." In 2 Peter 1:19, it says, "We have the prophetic word more fully confirmed, to which you would do well to pay attention, as to a light shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star arises in your hearts." Consider this passage from Isaiah 9:2. "The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light, and those who dwell in the land of deep darkness, on them has light shone." Matthew 4:13. "And leaving Nazareth, he," that's Jesus, "went and lived in Capernaum, by the sea in the territory of Zebulun and Naphtali." Verse 14 says, "So that what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah," right, we just read that, "might be fulfilled." Verse 15, "The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles." Verse 16, "The people dwelling in darkness have seen a great light, and for those dwelling in the region and the shadow of death, on them light has dawned." Throughout the Bible, the concept of light is frequently used, as I mentioned before, to represent good and having your eyes opened, or the blindfold of deception removed. Or Acts 26:18 says to open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and a place among those who are sanctified by faith in me. Notice we start with the darkness and we end with the illumination, right? That's exactly what we see in the beginning there. There was evening and morning. Check this out in John 8:12. It says, "Again, Jesus spoke to them saying, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Is verse 5 simply a straightforward verse talking about evening and morning as a natural phenomena? Yes. But is there more implied? Perhaps like this darkness to light motif that we see consistently throughout the scriptures? Very likely. Okay, let's move along. Verse 6, "And God said, let there be an expanse in the midst." You also might know the word firmament, depending on your translation, but "let there be an expanse or firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening and there was morning the second day." There are many others, who can explain this firmament or expanse to you much better than I can, and I'm going to let them do it. So I encourage you to find a good commentator or a great YouTube video or whatever you want, and you could just type these scriptures in and, or whatever, and there's probably fantastic explanations out there. All right. We're going to go into verse 9. Verse 9 says, "And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so." Verse 12, "The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit in which is their seed, each according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day." And verse 14, we got a lot to deal with here, okay? And verse 14 says, "And God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons." We're going to talk about that word. "And for days and for years." Okay, before we get into this idea of signs and seasons, there's something else I want to address here. You'll notice that we already have light on day 1 in verses 2, 3, 4 area. But we don't have the sun and moon created until verse 14. Okay, so what's, kind of what's happening here, well, keep in mind, God created everything for one, and he doesn't break it down and say God created atoms and molecules and all of these kind of things. Okay, those are things we discover scientifically. Those are the elements that God used to create. Okay, he doesn't talk about the thermal light or thermal energy that creates light. He doesn't talk about those things. But we deduce those things. We encounter those things through scientific methods, right? And so we discover how God created. But just because the sun and moon are not mentioned in verses 4 and 5, or earlier in the book, does not mean that that there's something strange going on here necessarily. Okay, I don't think we need to make a whole lot out of it, and the reason is because of something that we find if we jump ahead a few verses to verse 18. In verse 4, on day 1, God separated light from the darkness. Okay. So there's a darkness that's already here. There's a light that's been spoken, and those two are separated. But verse 18 probably clarifies the whole issue when it says, God gave the two great lights to rule over the day and over the night, and ready? And to separate light from darkness. So it seems to me that on verse 4, day 1, it's looking forward to verse 18, and vice versa. 18's looking back to verse 4. Okay. I do want to point out that later in the book, the sun, moon, and stars are used metaphorically to represent Jacob, Leah, and Jacob's 12 sons, or 11 sons. We'll get to that. In a dream that Jacob's son Joseph had, he saw the sun, the moon, and the stars, which bow down before him, which his father Jacob rebukes him for his dream, and he says, "Is myself and your mother and your brothers, are we supposed to bow down to you?" Now, I won't spoil it for you if you haven't read it yet. Yes, they did, but not exactly how we might interpret that. It's very interesting. We'll find it later in the book. So, does that mean we're dealing with some strange figurative things for the sun, moon, and stars in Genesis 1:14? No. And I'm not even implying it, okay? We're literally dealing with the sun, moon, and stars. I just want to point it out ahead of time that the Bible employs figurative language. So let's move on a little bit. There's this concept of Jacob and Leah and his sons representing the sun, moon, and stars is perhaps why the Methodist commentator Adam Clarke uses an allegorical interpretation to explain Matthew 24:29. Now, in case you don't know what that verse says, just off the top of your head, if you haven't got the whole Bible memorized yet, what are you waiting on? But it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Trust me, this is not a simple verse, okay? There's a lot going on here. This is how Adam Clarke interpreted the passage. I'm going to read it. It's a little bit lengthy, but bear with me. He says commentators generally understand this and what follows this of the end of the world and Christ coming to judgment. But the word immediately shows that the Lord is not speaking of any distant event, but of something immediately consequent on calamities already predicted. And that must be the destruction of Jerusalem, he says. He says, the Jewish heaven shall perish, and the sun and moon of its glory and happiness shall be darkened and brought to nothing. He says the sun is the religion of the church, the moon is the government of the state, and the stars are the judges and doctors of both. He says compare Isaiah 13:10, Ezekiel 32:7, and verse 8, and he references Dr. Lightfoot, who was another commentator. And he says, in the prophetic language, great commotions upon the earth are often expressed under the notion of commotions and changes in the heaven. Now, although I do agree completely with that last statement, there's often prophetic language which is employed to show us events that are occurring on the earth, but it's used figuratively of events that are occurring in the heavens: sun, moon, stars, cosmic events, etc., etc. Although I do agree with that, I'm not sure I agree with his total premise on the more allegorical kind of interpretation or metaphorical interpretation of what's happening in verse 29. But I just wanted to show you that some people have understood that the Bible does use the sun, moon, star construct to figuratively represent events. And it seems like he's taken that one step further in his interpretation of Matthew 29 or 24:29. Okay, so for all you scientific types who would like to go a little bit deeper about the sun, moon, stars, and the planets, and et cetera, I suggest you check out Session 5 of Dr. Chuck Missler's Genesis Commentary. Your timestamp, and in case you're not familiar with a timestamp, that's just the timestamps where I'm telling you the start and the finish. Okay, so if you hear me say that, just know that's what I mean. So the timestamp starts at 9 minutes, 20 seconds approximately, and you can go through about 51 minutes and 30 seconds, and he has all kinds of interesting scientific data and things that help talk about the early period of creation. It's fantastic. We're not getting into all that today. And there's another phrase in Genesis 1:14 that I find very interesting. The first time I'd ever heard about it was in a teaching by Dr. Chuck Missler as he was doing his Genesis walkthrough. And we're going to refresh on our passage, and then we're going to talk about the phrase. And verse 14 says, and God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and for years. Okay, the signs and for seasons phrase referencing the sun and moon is very interesting. And as Dr. Chuck Missler points out, he says the word seasons is an unfortunate translation because the word actually means appointed times. Now, he translates it hamoyadim, but I think you'll find it most often moyadim, but that's probably not really a critical point in this instance. They're just the same words or root words. In fact, you'll see it sometimes as like moed, M-O-E-D, forgive the pronunciation or lack thereof. Okay, so we're talking more than seasons, because seasons to us in a modern context doesn't really encapsulate what's happening here. We're talking about appointed times. And although we're not going to tackle that phrase in depth, I do want you to be aware of it. And for those of you who like hidden mysteries in the Torah and statistics and probabilities, you can find something very interesting about the phrase signs and seasons in Dr. Chuck Missler's Session 5 Genesis Commentary from timestamp 51:28. The thing I would like to point out is that God did not create a big clock and hand it to Adam in the garden, who then passed it down to Seth and then passed it on, etc., etc. Now, I know that's humorous, you know, you can kind of see Adam with, you know, a big chain like Flavor Flav kind of around him and this big clock. But you know, that's not what happened, right? So they had, of course, it might not have mattered that much to Adam and Eve, but future generations have taken a big interest in time, right? That's what we've done. We govern our whole life by it, right? What time do I have to be here and there? What time does that event start? Everything we do is governed by the concept of time. Well, how did that happen for ancient Israel? How are they supposed to know when they're supposed to celebrate the Feast of Booths or Purim or Passover? How are they supposed to know when they're supposed to celebrate all of these events? Well, that is happening on a lunar calendar, a lunar cycle. Okay, so God has given us repeating patterns in the fact that the earth is revolving around the sun and the moon's revolving, and all of these things are happening, and we have 24-hour days, right, and 365-day years approximately. Anyway, with that being said, what's interesting here is that the ancient Jews would have used the moon as a method of determining when certain events were to occur. So let's consider Leviticus 23, 1 and 2. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed festivals," or, you ready for the word? Moedim, "and the appointed festivals of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies." Okay, great. And let's add one more verse to it for support for today. Numbers 9, verses 2 through 3. It says, "Let the Israelites celebrate the Passover at the appointed time," that's the Moed, okay, "celebrated at the appointed time at twilight on the 14th day of the month, in accordance with all of its rules and its regulations." So, at the time, I'm not aware of an ancient calendar at that period. Not to say there wasn't one, okay? So you guys that are really into your history and your archaeology, please don't hang me out to dry here. But if there was one, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. But I'm not aware of an ancient calendar. At least the Bible doesn't make note of one that the Israelites carried with them on kind of stone. They chiseled off a day. But what we do see is a lunar cycle where certain rotations of the moon indicated that it was time to celebrate certain things. So I think that is very interesting. And also, that is how we're going to wrap up today's teaching. Thank you so much for joining me. If you don't know, I did write a book, my debut novel. It's called A Picture of the Heart. It is allegorical fiction based in portal fantasy. And if you don't know what all that means, it basically means I'm telling a great big old spiritual story through this adventure that happens through this created world. That's all there is to it, okay? I happen to be a little biased, but I think it's a fantastic story. And I'd love for you to get your own copy. You can go to Amazon. You can find it under A Picture of the Heart. You can search for me. The name on the book is Timothy Copeland. And you can also go to my website, timantoncopeland.com, to my bookstore, and you can get it on there. We are also working on its prequel and hope to have it out within the first quarter of this year, hopefully sometime around March, and that gives you an idea of how all the events took place in the realm of White Oak in my book, A Picture of the Heart. So thank you so much. There's digital copies available as well, I think for 99 cents on Amazon, and various other platforms than Kindle through my website. So thanks again. May the Lord enrich your lives with the knowledge of the Almighty. Amen.